Hey everybody, welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. As always, Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I are joined by Dr. Carolyn Lovewell, aka Carolyn Elliott, PhD. Carolyn wrote a book called Existential Kink, Unmask Your Shadow and Embrace Your Power, that Reid and I really liked, so we reached out to her to have her on the show to talk about it. In our conversation today, we'll discuss this unique approach to shadow work, the importance of surrender when trying to integrate our shadow parts, how the mysteries of Eleusis inspired Carolyn to create what she calls her sleepover mystery school, who existential kink is for, and maybe some folks it's not appropriate for, and of course, much, much more. Carolyn is a delightful human, and I think you're really going to enjoy this take on shadow work. Folks, there are still a few spots left in our January 2024 cohort of the Fundamentals of Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy course. So, if you're interested in good training on how to use psychedelics in a clinical practice, click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/our-training-selection and use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings. You hear Reid and I talk a lot about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinus does. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support the show, please do so by leaving us a rating or review. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with somebody you think might enjoy today's episode. And without further ado, here's our conversation today with Dr. Carolyn Lovewell/Elliott. Well, welcome back, everybody, to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers. Reid and I are excited to be joined today by Dr. Carolyn Elliott. How you doing, Carolyn?
I'm good. I just like to wave when I hear my name.
Well, and I noticed in your title here on our little recording, it says Carolyn Lovewell. Did we get your last name wrong?
Yes.
Is there a change there?
It's a complex thing because my name was Carolyn Elliott, and that's what my book says. And that's how many people know me. But recently, my husband and I created a new last name for our family. So our last name is Lovewell now. Yeah. And so we're in the process of legally changing it on all my social media and email. So it's a big process, and I'm still not sure how to navigate that with the book. I'm like, I'm the author of that book. Please believe me. But anyways.
That's really neat. I'm so curious how that idea came to be, because as you share it, I'm wondering why more people don't do that in this world of just questioning. Take on someone's name, hyphenate, keep, versus this cool idea.
Oh, thank you. Well, I could go on and on about it, but basically both my husband and I wanted to create a fresh dynasty apart from all the intergenerational trauma that we've inherited. So we chose a new last name and we're running with it.
Cool.
Well, it was a good choice too. Lovewell. So, Carolyn, you mentioned your book. Just to kind of give the audience a peek at why Reid and I asked you to come on. We were talking before we hit record that we were thinking a little over a year ago, Reid and I came across your book, Existential Kink. And as mental health professionals, very, very interested in it and working closely with shadow work, I thought it was a really, really curious and fascinating and potentially really, really powerful take on shadow work. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but I would love to just dive right in and give our listeners an idea of what existential kink is all about.
Sure, I can try to briefly explain it. So existential kink is both kind of a life attitude and life philosophy and a specific meditational practice. So I'll talk about sort of the general philosophy. The general idea of existential kink is that all of us humans have desires that we are utterly unconscious of. Our conscious ego personality is not aware of these desires, and they're desires for things like rejection, scarcity, humiliation, all of these sort of like dark, sort of painful things. And like I said, they are unconscious. The ego definitely does not want those things. Our egos tend to want really good stuff. We want approval. We want everybody to like us. We want lots of money and good health and all of that, respect. But there's these, like I said, unconscious desires for other stuff. And the premise of existential kink is that, it's based off of a famous quote from Carl Jung. So Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate." And of course, there's tons of stuff in the unconscious. There's these disowned, repressed, weird desires like I'm talking about. And there's also all sorts of other stuff. But the premise of existential kink is we can make, how do I say, that these desires sort of shape our life in a sideways kind of way. They become our fate as long as they're unconscious, as long as I don't know that I have a desire to experience scarcity and rejection and humiliation. I will accidentally create that for myself over and over again in my life. So the notion is that we can make these desires conscious by giving them radical approval, radical embrace, and actually celebrating, really just insanely celebrating the results that they create in our life, the fate that they create in our lives. And when we do that, there's this kind of, there's this alchemical meeting of the conscious and the unconscious minds, which can be really orgasmic and release all this energy, heat and energy and light. And it's kind of like the creation of a sun. It can be this almost atomic energetic burst. And when that happens, we no longer need to keep repeating those patterns in our life anymore. So those unconscious, shadowy desires for bad stuff, for humiliation, for rejection, for scarcity, I named those because those are really like the top common ones. They become conscious and they lose their power because in so many ways, the unconscious really is, it's the deep, dark, feminine womb part of us, the generative part of us. And once those desires are conscious, they become neutralized in a way. And I have a whole metaphor for it based on courtly love. Should I go ahead and give my courtly love metaphor of existential kink? It's not in the book, so maybe it'll be interesting.
I would love to hear it.
Yeah, so I think of it as, the conscious mind, the ego mind, is like a knight who wants to go on a quest. Our egos were like, I'm going to go out into the world, I'm going to get love and success and good health and make people like me. That's what pretty much all of us are wanting. We're all like identical in that way. Humans are so adorable. And that's what the conscious mind is doing. But the conscious mind, the knight, needs the support of the lady, right? So the lady, in this metaphor, would be the unconscious mind. So in order to get the support of the lady, get the lady's love, get the lady's approval, get the lady's blessing, that's what the knight needs so that he can fulfill his goal. Without that blessing, without that love, without that empowerment from his lady, the knight is powerless in a way. But he can't berate her into it. He can't say, look, I want this, so you better give me your approval. You better get on board with what I want. That doesn't work with a lady. The knight has to kneel down. He has to totally devote himself humbly, vulnerably, in love to the lady and the way that the lady already is and what she's already doing. And when the knight humbles himself and surrenders in that very, very deep way, when the conscious mind surrenders in that very, very deep way, there's a union in love between the knight and the lady, between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And in that union, there's a fertilization where the unconscious mind actually becomes fertilized with the desires of the conscious mind and begins to be able to, blesses and empowers the knight to go and fulfill his dreams. And so the conscious mind, the conscious personality becomes blessed and empowered by the unconscious, and the unconscious begins to give birth to synchronicities, which match up with the desires of the conscious personality instead of the other way around, which is how it tends to be before that deep humbling and surrender starts to happen. So that's my fun little chivalric metaphor about it.
Ooh, I like it. Thank you for that. I love the metaphors. And in fact, I was going to ask when you mentioned these common categories of our unconscious desires like humiliation, rejection, scarcity, if you could share an example or two, an example of one or each or whatever, because those I found in your book were the only way for me to really grasp these shadowy things enough to try them on. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I can certainly give examples. So, like you might remember from my book, the big example that I give is that I really was in a condition of scarcity for most of my 20s. I was in a PhD program. I was broke. I was broke after I got out of the PhD program. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I worked, I could not seem to get beyond this like very tiny, pathetic level of income. I was like standing in line at the food bank. I was sleeping on friends' couches. And the inception of Existential Kink was me getting very, very honest with myself and very, very curious, because I'd read all this psychology stuff in grad school. And I'd also read all of this sort of new thought, manifesting, law of attraction stuff. And I was like, gosh, if my desires create reality, if my unconscious creates my fate, could it be that I have unconscious desires for this scarcity, this poverty that I'm experiencing? And I really, I just sort of held it as a gentle curiosity, and I observed myself, and I observed that I did indeed actually get physically turned on when I thought about nobody ever paying me for anything. It was this sort of deep experience. Like, I was like, what if, nobody should ever, ever, ever pay me for anything? And I was like, wow, immediately turned on by that. And I was like, oh my gosh, whoa, I don't just have a bedroom kink. I have an existential kink. This applies to my whole existence. This is my concerns my whole life. And I realized that I couldn't. And so I said to myself, well, this is happening. I might as well let myself enjoy it. I might as well consciously get on the side of this apparently, previously unconscious desire that's been shaping my life in such a deep way. And, that scarcity that I was experiencing with money had rejection and humiliation wrapped up in it, because I was humiliated all the time. Every time my friends from college would ask me to go out to dinner, they all had jobs. And I totally didn't. And, I could barely afford dinner and drinks, or I'd be scraping from credit cards or having other people cover my bill. It was humiliating having to tell the landlord why I couldn't pay rent. Oh my gosh. And rejection. I was constantly feeling rejected from possible jobs, feeling rejected by possible clients. It was intense. So anyways, I was like, okay, well, this is happening. And maybe this part of me deserves love and deserves fulfillment as much as any other part of me. And that's a big part of the existential kink philosophy that I like to emphasize, because sometimes people don't understand it as much, which is that all of parts of us, conscious or unconscious, are totally innocent and totally worthy of love, even if they're creating results in our life that we don't like. That's not because they're malicious. It might just be because they're unskillful or whatever. They're doing what they're doing. So anyhow, I found that I could set time aside each day, and this is where the existential kink meditation developed, but I could set time aside each day to just practice getting on the side of the part of me that loved it, that just loved the humiliation, loved the scarcity, the tension, the will I make it this month? Won't I make it? And I found that the more that I could consciously, deliberately do that, eventually I could let myself actually have physical, erotic, orgasmic experiences with it. Or sometimes it would be more like a heart orgasm. It would be like a laughter and a heartfelt release. And as that happened, I would actually have different reactions to the scarcity, to the rejection, to the humiliation when it came up, which was, I was actually so crazy that I was able to enjoy it and like find it fun to get a bill in the mail and have no idea how am I going to pay this bill. And instead of it being like this painful anxiety thing, it would be like, oh my God, this is delightful. How did I, all my dreams are coming true. There's a huge part of me that wants it and it's getting what it wants. Yay, I'm winning. And I became so, I honestly started to feel completely fulfilled. I could feel all of this genuine delight that a large, deep part of me was receiving in these circumstances. And it was so interesting. As soon as that happened, I was very soon after that. It was just a matter of, I think it was a couple of months. My whole perspective on life changed. I started to be open to ideas that I was not open to before because my identity shifted. And that's another thing that I like to emphasize, which is that this existential kink stuff, change happens when the identity change happens, when I stop seeing myself as a fundamentally deprived person and start seeing myself as a fundamentally fulfilled person. I became able to access all sorts of thoughts and ideas that I wasn't able to access previously. And very soon after that, it was crazy. I started making 10 times as much money as I had been making. And then it's just been escalating from there. Well, that was a bit of a rambly response to your question. Was that?
Thank you.
Did I do what you wanted me to do?
Yeah, no, that was so helpful. And just a follow-up, I'm wondering where you think that scarcity comes from for you or in general. Is this like someone being addicted to their own suffering because it's familiar, for example?
Totally. It absolutely can be that. I mean, I often wonder that, like, why is this happening? What's up with this? Because this phenomenon that I write about in Existential Kink and that I noticed in myself and that I've experienced with lots of people that I've worked with and helped them move through it. The Freud and Jung and Adler, the founders of psychotherapy, were well aware of it. Freud called it psychic masochism. Obviously, Jung talked about people having shadowy desires. I read a book of Freud's letters years ago. I wish I had written down the citation of exactly which letter it was. But in his letters, he was talking about how I can't just tell people that they want taboo things. I have to use dream interpretation to get them to understand that their own psyche is telling them that they want taboo things, because they won't just hear it from me. But that's the essence of the therapy, is if I can get people to understand the way that they are participating in creating their own problems, then I can heal them. Then they can get some relief. So anyways, as soon as anybody begins to really start to focus on how the unconscious works, it becomes very apparent the way that we humans create our own problems. Wait. I've lost the track of the question that you asked me. Ask me the question again.
It was just the origin of these. And I guess related to that, is the origin important to understand or in many cases irrelevant? Because you just know that this force is there. If you can trace it back, great. If not, it's still transformative to embrace and have a party with that part of you that wants something kind of maladaptive or that might seem counterproductive.
Absolutely. So that's a great point. And I think in a certain way, the question of why or how do we get these desires is a little bit, we don't need to be able to answer that question in order to do great alchemical work to resolve those issues. And I have seen, people do tend to get hung up on that question, like, well, why do I have this issue? Is it because my mom yelled at me? Is it because my dad lost his job? Is it because in my last life I burnt down an orphanage? Why? Yeah, the why doesn't matter exactly as much as the fact that it's there and it's part of you and you can celebrate it and embrace it and get crazy with it, or you could just continue to be tortured by it, whatever you like.
Cool. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's such I think for a lot of people, so counterintuitive, this idea that, I mean, they notice that they get stuck in self-defeating patterns. And you know, lay out several of them in your book, like the stereotype of, I continue to date the person that hurts me the worst. And I just sort of keep coming back to that type of person over and over and over again. And all my friends see the pattern, and I even see the pattern. So how do I explain to myself that I'm doing this? And it's really, really tough to say, well, like you might say, it's because you get off on it. It's because there's a part of you that really, really likes being controlled, or likes being humiliated or rejected, or undervalued, or whatever it is. And your work kind of reminds me of other approaches to shadow work. One in particular from Phil Stutz's book, The Tools. He talks about, approaching one's shadow, and also approaching the things that are outside of the comfort zone in this paradoxical way, right? You shift from a place of radical rejection to a place of radical acceptance. Insofar as you even say, I want the pain, because the pain signifies something that's helpful, or it means I'm on the right path, kind of from a Stoic philosophy perspective, the obstacle being the way, or whatever. So I noticed some universal principles, I think, in reading your book, but the kinky approach, Carolyn, was so alarming to me as sort of this, boy raised in a Mormon household in Utah who has since left his religion, so fascinated by the use of kink and sexual energy, but also, maybe even a little terrified by it, and which is maybe what makes it so exciting. But I was going to ask you, a lot of your examples in your book are of women using this. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like it is more accessible to women than it is to men, or is that distinction unhelpful? What's your experience as sort of the creator of this, and also as a coach?
Yeah. So, I mean, interestingly, women buy self-help books and spirituality books at much greater rates than men. So that's part of why my book is marketed towards women. It's been a successful marketing strategy. It absolutely applies to anyone, though. It absolutely applies for all humans. In fact, I have a large amount of ex-Mormons do seem to particularly enjoy the book. So that's really awesome. And it's, I've definitely had plenty of male clients, and men in my classes and my mystery school. And it's, how do I say? Yeah, absolutely. Anybody can find it within themselves to give this utterly insane. It's insane from the perspective of the ego. It is absolutely insane to humble oneself to the point that one says, you know what, actually, there's a part of me that likes this awful thing, and I'm getting on the side of that part. I'm just going to do it because I'm that fucking crazy and I don't even care anymore. And when one gets to that point of it's mad. Like, I feel like I'm a mad hatter, holding a tea party lots of times. That level of madness is alchemically healing in a really marvelous way. And in a way that, so like I said, I run something called Sleepover Mystery School, which is sort of like a combination between a very serious mystery school of antiquity and a very naughty teenage co-ed slumber party. And, it's really marvelous. And part of why it works is because existential kink very rapidly tends to get people in touch with the more magical dimensions of themselves, with their soul. Because one explanation for why do we have these weird, shadowy desires that seem to shape our lives in these negative ways, why is that there? My answer to that at the deepest level, beyond trauma, past lives, everything, the deepest answer to that is I believe the soul, what Jung called the self with a capital S, is interested in the whole smorgasbord of potential experience in human incarnation, life and death, pain and pleasure, being powerless, being powerful, having, experiencing humiliation, scarcity and rejection, experiencing fulfillment, wealth, respect, all of those things. It's like the soul hungers to taste all of it. And the ego, which Jung also talked about, ego suffers this, it's a psychotic delusion. And it's a psychotic delusion that it is the whole of ourselves. It is the whole of our being. And this psychotic delusion has reached a fever pitch here in, modern Western society at the end of the 21st century. The mind-body dualism of Descartes, it's just amplified to this like crazy extent where people are very, very many modern people who don't have the wisdom and the insight to be involved in healing work and psychedelic work, are like completely oblivious to what's going on in most of their being. They don't pay attention to their dreams. They don't try to interpret their dreams. They don't, they have very one-sided political views or very one-sided ideas about how life should be, how people should be. Anyhow, it's utter psychosis. And the antidote to that psychosis seems psychotic from the point of view of psychosis, which is to go ahead and enjoy the taboo thing, enjoy the thing that takes us closer to death. Rejection, humiliation, we fear that because we humans are social beings, and we know that rejection and humiliation can lead to exile and death. So there's a certain level of surrender to death, of surrender to the complete unknown, which is necessary to do this integrative work and to do this healing work. Anyways, that's why I run a mystery school, because ritual is a very effective way to help people open up to that level of surrender. And because I forgot what question I was answering.
Oh, I like it. And the mystery school, and if I heard it right, the sleepover mystery school sounds intriguing and super cool.
Yeah, like a modern Eleusis.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Oh, you said my favorite word. I actually named my daughter Eleusis. We call her Lulu for short. That's how serious I am about Eleusis. Yes, exactly. And as fans of, psychedelic therapy, you and practitioners of it, not just fans, you must be familiar with that, the whole mythos of Eleusis, which, many people do speculate that there was a psychedelic substance that was used in those mystery ceremonies. For me, that's like the center of my life's work, is the revival of mystery culture, which goes hand in hand with the emerging psychedelic therapy things. I'm so grateful for the work that you two do and for that blossoming, that renaissance that's happening, because we have been at this psychotic state for so long. We have to learn how to inhabit our wholeness if anything is going to change.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so many parallels I'm noticing as you discuss kind of the ritual aspect of your work, the what I called sort of maybe counterintuitive from the perspective of the ego approach, right? To actually open yourself up to and say that you like the things that your ego would say you need to destroy, or you need to completely control, or you need to completely change. I'm noticing a lot of parallels between that and often how we coach people to navigate a psychedelic headspace, right? A not an ordinary state where the resistance is the thing that amplifies the suffering. It is that surrender to this thing that you think you want to avoid, that you don't want to see, that allows you to pass through it and experience bliss or experience healing or experience wisdom or teaching. So I wonder if when somebody is trying to practice existential kink, if there is an element of surrender. I'm also thinking about sort of leader-follower dynamics in relationship kink, but there's this safety in surrender. So I guess my question for you is, what's the role of surrender in existential kink, if any?
Oh, yes. It is the primary action of existential kink, is surrender to life as Dom, life as the leader or the top in the BDSM scene. And the funny thing about, life or the universe or God as a Dom is that there's no safe words. There's no safe words. There's no, most of the time we don't have any recollection of creating some sort of consensual scene agreement with life, with God as our Dom, which is, it seems like it's happening very non-consensually. It seems like, oh, I'm it's totally non-consensual, this whole incarnation and everything that's happening to me within it, including all of this, physical vulnerability and potentials of death and illness and wow, I'm going to die. Everybody that I love is going to die. This whole thing can seem really pretty miserable from the point of view of not consenting to it. So part of an existential kink practice is we have to, create those agreements and that surrender and that consent within ourselves that in a BDSM experience would be created between, two partners in a conversation before the scene, right? So it's, part of what I focus on all of the time is inviting myself to realize that there's a certain way in which God, life, the universe is the perfect lover, is the perfect Dom. And they're always stroking me on the most resonant spot of my being. And this is something I learned from being in the orgasmic meditation community. There was all sorts of scandals associated with that community, but I like to say that, the practice itself was brilliant, just like hot yoga is brilliant, even if the dude who popularized it was scandalous. So anyways, the practice of orgasmic meditation, a brilliant practice in which one focuses meditatively, or two people actually, on the sensations of, a finger stroking a clitoris. And I did thousands of hours of orgasmic meditation. And there's a certain way in which an orgasmic meditation practice one discovers, at least I discovered, that there would be times, so the goal of the stroker, and again, there were strokers that I worked with who had spent thousands of hours stroking. The stroker's finger magnetically gets drawn to the place on the clitoris that most wants to be stroked, you could say. There's a certain magnetism that happens between finger and clitoris. And there's this deep experience that I would have, which I would notice that there would be times when the magnetic spot that the stroker was tuned into did not feel good to me. And my mind had zero approval of it. And I would want the stroker to change the stroke. And of course, that's part of a orgasmic meditation practice. Sorry, I'm getting kind of ahead of myself. I realize probably lots of your listeners have never heard of this before. And I'm talking about like the deep specifics of a really esoteric practice. To give a little bit more context, orgasmic meditation is a partnered practice. It's 15 minutes long. It's this very regimented, almost militarily precise sort of thing where there's a stroker who wears gloves, there's lube, there's a whole set of procedures, and a woman lays down in like what's called a nest, which involves pillows and blankets. She butterflies her legs open. The stroker sits beside her. The stroker would usually be a guy, although obviously it could be anybody. And would stroke the clitoris in this very precise way for 15 minutes with a timer being set. And there was this whole language around it, upstrokes and downstrokes and, this resonance. And after the stroking session, the person being stroked and the stroker would share what were called frames about what they experienced during the meditation session. So it was from this sharing of frames that I learned in conjunction with the people doing the stroking, that there's always this limbic connection. There's always this like psychic, energetic sort of magic happening of this kind of magnetism that I'm describing. So anyways, I had this firsthand embodied experience of, I knew that the stroker was stroking the most magnetic spot, and that I didn't like it, that my conscious mind did not like it. So the invitation in the practice would be to see, for the people being stroked, would be to open up, see how much you can expand and surrender to being stroked at the most magnetic spot, even though your conscious mind doesn't like it, says it doesn't feel good. See what it's like to surrender. So that's what I would do. I would practice surrendering. And so that would be like opening the window of sensation that I could say yes to, that I could orgasmically receive. And I found through practice and experimentation that I could open that window really wide and have this, very literally orgasmic experience in the meditation. And I realized that life is just exactly the same way. Life is always stroking me on the most magnetic resonant spot. We're all just giant clitorises or cocks or whatever. We're all being stroked. We're all being made love to by life. And there's lots of strokes that are magnetic, resonant, potentially orgasmic strokes, to which my mind says, oh, no. Oh, I do not like that. That is all wrong. It should be happening this way. That's it. And my mind is a liar. The ego mind is just pure lies, essentially, because if I can surrender and open myself to the resonant strokes of life, which are always happening, it's whatever is going on is always that stroke, then my life can be utterly ecstatic and utterly joyful and utterly outside of my conscious mind's control and utterly a billion times better than my conscious mind's preferences would ever have them be. And you mentioned, actual real life, relationship dynamics. So I wrote in my book about a terrible abusive relationship I had with a guy who was like really jealous and controlling. So what's funny is I'm in a relationship now with a wonderful, beautiful man. My husband is so sweet, so loving, so kind. And he also does these things sometimes that like my mind will label as controlling. Like, ugh, he's trying to control me. I hate that. How dare he? Is so rude. And, this is not within a specific container that we've created or anything. Well, I mean, we sort of have. It's a long story. But I have found that, again, if I give myself permission to like really in the moment just open up to like whatever the stroke that he's giving me, which is be something like, oh, maybe you could try it this way, or honey, why don't you do this? If instead of refusing that and resisting that and judging that as controlling, if instead I'm like, why, yes, sensei, master, husband, please tell me what to do. There's this like wonderful joy and eroticism that opens up that my ego finds very awful, just really still quite resistant to it, even though I experiment with it a lot. But obviously my body loves it, and I've married a man who behaves that way. So clearly I love it at a deep, deep place. And anyways, it's just so funny to me. Humans and my own humanity are just endlessly funny.
Yeah, that's another really useful example, I think, and of one of your axioms too, of having as evidence of wanting, like you said, like obviously I married this man, and as you were talking about this, I was remembering an interview I listened to where you mentioned that you're also a fan of Byron Katie's The Work, and we've talked about that on there, and I'm wondering, I'm starting to see some things that you mentioned you drew from the orgasmic meditation experiences. And I think you talked in that interview about how Byron Katie's The Work influenced it. But I wonder if you could talk about that a little more and if there are some parallels with that approach.
Oh, yeah. Hold on a second. It's getting warm talking about all of this, how much I enjoy being controlled. So, yes, I love Byron Katie. Love Byron Katie. She's an endless inspiration to me. And that was the genesis of how I was sort of touched on it a little bit earlier. In the beginning phase of me discovering that I had this existential kink, I was doing the work of Byron Katie one day on this judgment that I had, because I had learned that there was this other person I knew who was being a coach who was getting paid $1,000 an hour. And I was like inching by on far, far less than that. So I was doing the work of Byron Katie with the statement, people should want to pay me $1,000 an hour. And then I was doing the inquiry questions, and then I was turning them around, the opposite, right? And I turned it around. People should want to pay me thousands of dollars for coaching, to nobody should ever want to pay me anything for coaching. And that's when I felt this like incredible zing through my body. And I was like, well, goddamn, Carolyn, that's why nobody's paying you for coaching, because it turns you on so fucking much for nobody to want to pay you for coaching. If it really turned you on for people to pay you lots of money for coaching, then that's what would be happening. But anyways, so I find the work of Byron Katie to be a very helpful warm-up for existential kink practice, because it helps to loosen the mind from these, dogmatic ego beliefs that we can get so easily attached to. Like, I really believed that I wanted money, but it turns out my body said something completely else. And it's anyways, of something that I find to be very interesting with Byron Katie is that it's such a potent first-hand way to learn that we don't have to believe our thoughts, and that in fact believing what we think can be a very fast way to make ourselves completely miserable. So I love that practice of like turning them around to the opposites and finding ways that the opposite thing is equally true.
So Carolyn, I'm curious, and you talk about this a little bit in the book, who is this existential kink work for, and who is it not for? Or you could reframe the question any way that you would like, but would this be inappropriate for certain kinds of struggles, or for people that struggle a certain kind of way, maybe?
That's a wonderful question. So I hit a wall with my own existential kink practice in connection to patterns I had that were definitely tied to distinctive, really acute, intense childhood traumatic experiences that I had. So I do tend to think that existential kink works best on issues that we have, which kind of come from maybe pervasive cultural conditioning and not so much from like acute, terrible, traumatic events that happen to us. So it ended up that I needed to seek other tools to deal with that. And that's how I found my wonderful mentor, Robert D. McDonald, who does really, really deep work with something he calls the destination method, which is amazing for resolving trauma. So anyways, I found that there's other tools that work best for that. And also, if somebody is depressed and ruminating, so depression is not sometimes people are sad to hear this because they're like, well, I'm depressed and I want to use existential kink to get out of my depression. It's just from my personal experience and from working with clients, I don't think it works very well. Because for the alchemical magic of existential kink to work, I like to say, it's very unscientific, but you have to have a certain amount of free floating positive energy in your body. You have to have a certain amount of pleasure, of humor, of perspective you can actually, zoom out to the point and make that, orgasmic surrendered leap. Usually if somebody is depressed, they're, they don't have that sort of resource in their body to get that spark going. So trying to do existential kink seems to lead just to like rumination for them, or else they warp it, and this is something that I hate to see, because existential kink is absolutely not about blame or shame. Like, those things just keep things repressed in the unconscious, but people can definitely take take this attitude of like, oh, I'm just having this experience because I like it, and I'm so terrible, and it's just why am I so fucked up? I just like this horrible thing, and they make it into like this weird self-flagellating, sarcastic, ironic thing, like, oh, I must really like living with my parents because it's happening. And it's like, baby, you're just taking this tool that I'm trying to give you to get out of your situation and turning it into like a weird, sarcastic self-pity thing. Like, please don't do that. because obviously, like we're talking about, for the existential kink practice to work, it demands a completely unironic, totally surrendered, totally humble, actually open, orgasmic surrender. So there's definitely, so depression, grief. Oh my gosh. Sometimes people have come to me and they've been like, my father died. How am I going to EK this? And I'm like, you're not. Please don't try to. That doesn't make any sense. Like, I mean, obviously, like grief, I mean, grief is a part of human experience, and we all have to encounter it in various ways. And there can be a certain deep joy and pleasure in grief. Anyways, but it's not like, it's just not the sort of thing that existential kink responds to. You can't EK your father back to life. That's like,
yeah. Yeah, but maybe after a certain point of the grieving process, I know people have different ways of trying to define when one has grieved and not, and what is enough. And one of my teachers, I remember saying, grief is like a river, and it's just going to flow in some way forever. But point is, I wonder if along the way somewhere, whether it's depression or grief, or on the healing journey from trauma, when you're resourced and stabilized enough, if this tool, this approach could be used productively with the right kind of guidance, perhaps, knowing those are careful situations. Like one example that came to mind when you're talking about depression, and I appreciate the comments, by the way, the warnings of when you might not want to just dive in recklessly. But I remember working with a client with depression. I've done this several times, of having them celebrate, throw a party for their depression. But that's at some point on the way to, give it some love, give that chapter some love in that, positive direction in line with all the parts of you to help move through it. Like in this adage that Steve and I often say, the only way out is through. And with existential kink, you might as well make it fun, right? The way through that.
Yeah, well, I hear you. And I love that you've had that experience with clients who are depressed and getting them to throw a party for their depression. And yeah, I can totally see how with support and, good timing, an existential kink approach can be useful. Yeah.
Carolyn, I'm curious, I know, as you coach people to practice EK, what are some other ways that people, quote unquote, do it wrong, right? Or they're, they think they're doing it, they think they're applying it in the way that you instruct, but they're missing something. Can you think of any examples?
Oh boy, let me think for a moment. I think the main way that people miss the mark is what I was just talking about, which is when they take it on as sort of like this fun intellectual thing, and they take it on as a, oh wait, another way that people miss the mark is by taking it on as something that other people should do. So I've had people get very, and this is, I've had, how do I say? Sometimes people immediately somehow want to apply it to like collective societal issues, because I mentioned there's like 2 lines in the book about, the potential for collective shadow integration. And actually, the more that I think about collective shadow integration, the more I think about like, well, the archetype of the shadow for the collective unconscious is pretty much the devil. So a reckoning with the collective shadow is a reckoning with whatever you take the devil to be. And the most successful example of that I can find is actually Jung's essay, An Answer to Job, which is sort of like this very deep personal essay where he's wrestling with God's dialogue with Satan in connection with the sufferings of Job. Anyhow, that's a confrontation with the collective shadow. But of course, there's this big vogue for, what does one call it, like woke social justice sort of thing. So I'll hear people go on tears about like, oh, this group of people should do existential kink and get off on their problems so they stop causing problems for other people. And how do we get these other people to do shadow integration? Sorry, which just makes me laugh so hard because obviously with shadow integration, like it's a fucking do-it-yourself project. Like, be the change you want to see. If you want any shadows to be integrated, you must integrate them in yourself. So anyways, that's one way that people miss the mark. The other way is what we just talked about with people taking this like intellectual attitude and then using it to like be weirdly sarcastic. And when they do that, like, it makes me sad because it's like they're taking something which is, you know, a potentially revolutionary truth that could utterly transform their being, which is that a part of them, a completely innocent, lovable, worthwhile part of them, desires the situation that they're in. And they make that into like this sarcastic thing to beat themselves up with and ruminate about. So the perpetual challenge with existential kink and with, you know, in my online communities, the coaching that we do, and we have an existential kink coach training program, is helping people create the kind of trust and relaxation and belief in the deep innocence of all parts of themselves to the point that they are able to unironically open up to that surrender. I'm trying to think another way that people miss the mark, they get it wrong. I would say starting with things that are too big, like trying or you know, like trying to like what was one that somebody was talking about? You know, they wanted to find a way, like the love of their life had dumped them. They just had like somebody had broken up with them. They were heartbroken about it. And this is sort of connected to the grief thing. They were like, how do I EK this? And I'm like, again, you actually have to grieve it. You actually can't skip the grieving part. Like maybe after you thoroughly grieve it, you can open up to the pleasure in the rejection. But really what I recommend to people is that they start with something that's not like a momentous awful thing in their life, like a singular awful event, but rather something that's sort of like a chronic, ongoing thing. So like feeling, you know, feeling weird, feeling like an outsider. And like, can you open up to that? Can you let yourself get off on that? Like more like a daily level sort of thing rather than like a singular painful event.
Carolyn, this seems to be very delicate work and vulnerable work, right? Mm-hmm. And when you describe the intellectualizing piece, sort of the sarcastic intellectualizing approach that is a mistake, it sounds like a defended approach, right? It sounds like an egoic defended approach, because to surrender, as we've been talking about, to the reality that there's a part of you that really gets off on these self-defeating patterns can be really, really, I would imagine, scary for a lot of people. So to do this work sounds like it is, it takes a lot of courage and requires a lot of vulnerability. Do you find that people need a lot of encouraging? They need a lot of education? Or are there some people that sort of just settle right into it intuitively?
Oh my goodness. There's certainly some people that get it instantly. I mean, there's people that I've met who get it way better than I do, who are like, my dear friend Layla, who is my collaborator with the Mystery School, and she and I do a podcast together, and I've recently put her in charge of the online community that we have called Electric Yes. Layla's love of the taboo and her ability to give approval and to like really dark and twisted things is magnificent and so beautiful and has healed me so much. There's some people who are just like, you know, yeah, they're born shadow integration geniuses. They can just do the thing. And there's some people who, are really fascinated by the idea, but just, you know, don't know how to give themselves that kind of permission. So it's sort of an interesting thing, because when I first devised Existential Kink, I was like, well, this is a solo meditation. This is something that you read the book, because I experienced it as a solo meditation. But a lot of people they want guidance with it. So I have all these guided meditations that we've created. And again, part of why I created the Mystery School was to create an environment where people could have, and the online community, but sort of Mystery School, since it's in person, is even better. It's sort of like, it's much easier to get off in EK when you are surrounded by just like crazy, kinky, integrated, deep motherfuckers who do not like, just do not give a fuck and are like completely insane, it's far easier when you're in that environment to have that kind of deep release and surrender. So there is a certain thing where it's like, yeah, it's getting on the vibe, getting attuned to somebody who has that gnosis and has that ability is a really powerful thing, you know, almost like a classic, right, like Shakti pot from a guru kind of thing. And the example of this I'm thinking of is I have a friend of mine from the orgasmic meditation community. It was this gentleman named Leslie. And Leslie went on with his partner, Tawny, to create this wonderful thing called the Light Dark Institute, where they would teach these, they would do these in-person kink intensives and these in-person workshops. And anyways, part of the inspiration for Existential Kink was I'd be hanging out with Leslie back in the day, and he would have this bizarre look on his face. I would have like no idea what was going on with him. And I'd be like, Leslie, what's up? And he'd be like, oh, my heart is broken. I'm dying. And I'd be like, yeah, but okay, your heart is broken and you're dying, but you're kind of having fun. And he's like, it's so good. He just like knew how to aesthetically appreciate his own profound suffering. Again, in this like rather insane, you know, enlightened fool sort of way. And that transmission from Leslie like stuck with me forever, because I was like, wow, Leslie knows how to orgasmically experience his suffering. Let me try to do what Leslie does. Let me see if I can give myself that same mad level of embrace for my pain. And I mean, when I think about Leslie, I'm like, you know what? Leslie could get off on being dumped by the love of his life. He could get off on his father dying. 1000% I know that he could do it. Most mere mortals cannot. But
a new level.
anyways, yeah, so it was that transmission from him and the sort of the level of genius that he had reached with that empowered me to do it. So there is a certain way in which when people, you know, come into the online community or come into the mystery school, they get that transmission that like, yeah, it's actually possible to have an entirely different relationship with your sensations and emotions. You can, you know, what makes a sensation painful or pleasurable is the amount of deep approval and presence that you are able to give it. So when people learn that, they are able to begin expanding that window that their mind can receive as pleasure and begin to, I mean, this often happens, we see this with the people in the mystery school, is they do go into a sort of orgasmic condition in their life where, you know, so it's something that's interesting about physical orgasm, right, is that it is, there's a involuntary limbic element to it where it's just like, you know, you're out of control. And we do see that there's like, their lives tend to get like out of control awesome in some ways. Like they're just like, oh my God, all of these things are happening. I'm meeting all of these people. I'm having all of these new opportunities. I'm having this new creativity, and the old structures of my life are unraveling in some ways. And obviously it's very disorienting, and magic and initiation are kind of inherently disorienting because they're taking us into a new orientation. But yes, that is the answer to some question I was asked.
Yeah, that reminds me of something I wanted to ask earlier when you were talking about your experience with kind of feeling this orgasmic bliss around your scarcity, and when Steve was asking about some gender differences, and like in the case of that electric jolt, or how people experience uniquely their own pleasure, what might it look like for someone to, quote unquote, get off on their shadow? Or what are other ways, if someone has a hard time connecting with, that was, I feel orgasmic to this, or I have a jolt of energy, how do you know if you are subconsciously craving getting humiliated or scarcity or something like that?
Yeah, the main way that you know is that it's happening.
Evidence of Having is evidence of wanting, like you say.
Yeah. There's, I mean, so this gets into this whole deep thing, but of the relation between psyche and world and non-dualism, and how exactly is it that what is this reality that we seem to be experiencing? And I do think ultimately that world and psyche are somehow mysteriously made of the same stuff and do have this deep interaction. So yeah, there is, if it's happening, and if one has a somatic, if it's happening, period, is a sign to get curious about it and to experiment with opening up to, like, okay, here's this sensation of humiliation. Can I let myself die into it? There's this ego part of me that wants to resist it and wants to push it away. But what we resist persists. Can I experiment with letting in this divine, this is how the divine lover is touching me right now. Can my love for God and the universe be so crazy and so intense that I let myself be willing to receive it?
Yeah, it reminds me of all these fun parallels that show up mostly in the other religious schools of thought, like Eastern and Hinduism, but just or how they describe an orgasm in France would be le petit mort, little death, and just the symbolism of all of this is quite fascinating.
It is fascinating. It's sometimes there's the dance, the interaction of the opposites, right? Like electricity, how we get light from electricity, and there's like two poles and they're in this relationship and they're creating light and heat. That seems to be what it's all about. So one way that I think about existential kink is I think about, the scales of Libra, right? The scales of Ma'at. So there's a certain way in which our, my mind starts going into all this Aleister Crowley thalamic stuff because that's how I think of things often. But
yeah, fascinating stuff, by the way, Crowley. I've been thinking of some of his esoteric work as you've been sharing about Mystery School as well.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you're familiar with Aleister Crowley?
Yeah, I have a strange fetish of getting books from that era and reading them. So
me too. That's a fantastic fetish to have. Well, so Crowley talked about the various aeons of time, right? So he would say there was the aeon of Isis, there was the aeon of Osiris, and now we're in the aeon of Horus. And the aeon of Osiris is sort of this patriarchal age where this a necessary evolution of consciousness happened, but it was sort of an adolescent phase for humanity in the sense that we, at least, in Western Europe and the Western world, we became very into this dualism and this sort of ego psychosis. And we've gotten, the world became obsessed with like, how do we measure things, control things, exploit and extract in this kind of vigorous fashion that the philosopher Heidegger called the inframing. So this very inframing, extracting attitude, where something is always highly valued and something is always devalued. So the ego, the conscious mind is valued, the unconscious mind is devalued. Science is valued, magic is devalued. There's a certain way in which, being in control is valued, being out of control devalued. So anyhow, this big devaluation has happened within this recent 2,000, 3,000 years. So part of what needs to happen, as far as I understand, and I think Crowley would agree with me, is that the new evolution of human consciousness involves a balancing of the values so that the, magic and science are at an equal value. Conscious and unconscious are at an equal value. And so with existential kink, there's a way in which it's a deep valuing of the unconscious mind that happens, of the unconscious processes that are already occurring. And that balances out the scales to where this, we talked about this meeting is able to happen. The conscious and the unconscious come into a relationship that is quite like the poles of, negative and positive in electricity. And there is a release of heat and light and love. All the fun solar ecstatic things happen. And as far as I can tell, that's also how the universe is created every moment.
Yeah. Well, so do you know who Timothy Leary is?
Yes. This is so funny. Course. I was just talking with my husband about Timothy Leary. Yes.
Yeah. I figured you're quite familiar. Of course, but I remember seeing an article about Leary and he might have just been tripping at the time, but how he said he was an incarnation of Aleister Crowley. And he loved the tarot decks to bust them out, but he really identified with Crowley's work, it seems.
Yeah, he's very understandable that Leary would have that identification. I think I remember that interview that you're talking about. And Crowley, I think I think he is a super underrated genius. I think he laid the groundwork for so much of what Jung was able to do in a way that, I don't think, how do I say, like, I could go on about this for a long time, but, Jung's book, Aeon, I think that came out in the 1950s, 1951, maybe. So Aeon is about the relationship between Christ and Antichrist, and how there's a way in which it's only through understanding and accepting the relationship of Christ and Antichrist and holding them at equal values that one is able to have like the total gnosis of the self. And Jung talks about, how crazy society has been, and that we've for thousands of years in Europe, this image of a purely good God who was only merciful and only kind created this freaky shadow of, whatever the Antichrist, the opposite of that, which is like totally vicious and evil. And there has to be a balancing and a recognition that those are part of a larger whole. Anyhow, Aleister Crowley styled himself as the great beast 666 and saw himself
bringing Satan back.
Totally.
In a
new way, in an integrative way. I really think that honestly, by inhabiting that archetype, he did a giant favor, really like a bodhisattva level, self-sacrificial level favor in kind of completing that Christian mandala of Christ and Antichrist in a way that opened up what we can call the second coming of Christ, which I would call the second coming of Christ, which is the increasing availability to mass human awareness of the whole archetype of the self. Coming into wholeness.
Yeah, fascinating. And you mentioned at some point recently an Egyptian god and, going to the underworld, maybe way into the heart. Wondering if you can expand on that, because I love those metaphors and archetypes too, just for anyone who might have missed that reference.
Oh, baby, boy, do I love them. Yes, so much. I was talking about Osiris and Isis and Horus and so, it's funny. I've had like deep visionary experiences with a form of Horus known as Ra Hor-Kuit. And I've also had deep visionary experiences with another Egyptian deity named Ma'at, who's the goddess of, balancing the weighing of the heart. Ma'at is the one who weighs the heart. And when we can learn to bring the unconscious and the conscious into an equal level of valuation, that's the key to so much of everything. That's the key to Jungian individuation. That's the key to magical initiation. That's the key to fulfilling the great work. That's the Philosopher's Stone. That's the alchemical big shebang right there. And when one dies and it has one's heart weighed in the scales of Ma'at, right? So she puts a feather on the other side. So there's your heart, there's a feather. If your heart is as light as a feather, then you go to the realm of the immortals. To me, the only way to have one's heart be as light as a feather is to have a deep, deep, deep integration of everything, good and evil, masculine and feminine, life and death. Because if you don't have that integration and that relationship and acceptance, then of course you're going to be devaluing something, and that devaluing makes your heart heavy.
Yeah. In fact, I was thinking of that weighing of the heart and being lighter than a feather when you were talking earlier about taking kind of a comical approach to laughing at the suffering we find ourselves just coming back to subconsciously when we realize it, or just having fun with it. Seems to me to be maybe one of the ways people in that metaphor emerge from the underworld with, hearts light as a feather, after conquering some inner demons, or dancing with inner demons is probably a better way to think about it. So we can really kind of move forward in life and all its craziness with, more contentment and playfulness and joy. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. So well said. I think that really is it. I think, laughter is a sure presence of God. A sure sign of the presence of God. Laughter is God. So everything is. But yeah, I really agree with that.
Very cool. Well, Steve, I've been hogging the questions. What's coming up for you?
To be honest, I got all my burning questions in early. So, Carolyn, I'm wondering, is there anything else you'd like to say to our audience about EK, about the work that you're doing? We'll certainly put everything in the show notes, your website, your you mentioned your podcast, but I don't think you mentioned the name of your podcast. What's it called?
Yeah, the podcast is called Sleepover with Carolyn and Layla, and we talk about all sorts of far out stuff. So especially if people like magic, they should check that out. We also talk about existential kink quite a lot. What do I have to say about it? Well, it's really great. Everybody should do it. The more you do it, the better your life gets. That's what I've found. Yeah, it's really important. And it's also, I also am a deep participant in other methods of making the unconscious conscious. So dream work, remembering one's dreams, doing work to interpret one's dreams, I think is so important. And also the kind of theurgical work that I do, we teach it in Electric Yes and also in the Mystery School. And it's theurgical work that is directly tied to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the Mystery Temple at Eleusis. I mean, there's this whole lineage way that Eleusis eventually, over the centuries, the inheritors of that were the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and also Aleister Crowley was in that organization. So we do that mystery, theurgy, invocation of God into ourselves. And I'm really enthusiastic about it's this odd little book called The Middle Pillar by a gentleman named Israel Regardie, who was also a big fan of Carl Jung. And Regardie wrote about how theurgy makes the unconscious conscious. He just really made that brilliant connection. And I wish more Jungians knew about it, but they don't, because he was a magician and not a scientist or a therapist. But anyway, I truly believe that this, anyway, I could go on to many rants, but it's possible. I just want everybody to know that it is possible to do the work of individuation, to do the work of initiation, and to have a much more balanced, equilibrated perspective on life, which has a lot of joy and laughter and orgasmic ecstasy in it, and that materialist science has lied to us all. And life is way better than advertised, and magic is real. And anyways, yeah, we are currently in the last little bit of time taking applications for Sleepover Mystery School 2024. So I do hope that if folks listening are interested in this approach to life and in deeper integration and kind of a joyful, holistic approach to spiritual gnosis, that they go ahead and check that out. The Mystery School, well, and also the online program is amazing. Electric Yes has all sorts of existential kink coaching opportunities. We have social events. We have guided existential kink meditations. We have all sorts of tutoring in magic and theurgy in the online community. And the in-person sleepover mystery school is 4 weekends. 2 are in Miami, 1 is in rural West Virginia, and 1 is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I live. And we take people, well, they undergo a vow of silence, and they experience a profound initiation into the mystery tradition, which is directly inherited from Eleusis. And that's the thing that I'm most excited about because, well, anyways, I just have this, I'm an evangelical hermeticist, and I'm very deeply interested in getting as many people as possible to realize their wholeness and enjoy it. So I love doing that in the mystery school. And anyways, I think that's what I wanted to say. It was such a pleasure talking to you gentlemen today. I hope maybe you guys might join us at mystery school. I think you would have a really fun time.
Intriguing. I'm going to check it out.
Intriguing was the word that came to my mind too, Reid. Well, Carolyn, you seem like a person who is very aligned with her purpose, and that you have discovered something that was really helpful for you, and you made it a life's work to share it with others. And I respect that a hell of a lot. And I really appreciate how articulately and skillfully you communicated this process in your book, your willingness to come on our podcast and share this gift with our audience. So feeling a lot of gratitude. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Reid. Yes.
This has been wonderful. Thanks for joining us.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.